Hi, welcome to this session on the missing middle. So this is primarily a how-to session. The question I'm trying to answer is, how do we work towards ethical futures when government industry is so focused on business as usual? So we all know the world is on fire. Some people predict widespread collapse, others conflict, and nearly everyone's concerned about the loss of wealth. Regardless of the nature or extent of the crisis, all of us are at this conference because we want to build ethical futures. And that process is challenging because some governments are actively throwing ethics out the window. Clearly, the fear of an unethical or an unsustainable future is not sufficient to drive ethical behaviour. Most governments are not throwing out ethics. They're trying to reach the targets built into the Sustainable Development Goals. So here we see Ireland's response to Goal 12, nominating 5 of the targets within Goal 12 that they're measuring. But the SDGs themselves contain an ethical dilemma. They focus on development to the exclusion of sustainability in some people's view. And many people argue that a focus on economic development results in short-term incremental solutions that do not address the deep ethical challenges that we face. So not only are the targets on the screen somewhat timid, they do not demand anything of industry. So government is responsible for the fossil fuel subsidies, but the consumers are responsible for everything else on the screen. So Mariana Mazzucato at the University College of London has developed a widely accepted approach to developing impact maps that address wicked problems such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So on her screen we see the goal up the top with missions that might relate to the Sustainable Development Targets, and then we get down to this more complex area with the messy, which we could call the messy middle. So she extracts individual impact projects by creating cross-sectoral collaboration between stakeholders. And there's strong evidence that the ideological difference between these many stakeholders contribute greatly to the difficulty of resolving wicked problems. So by co-creating these impact projects, she resolves some of those conflicts, partly by self-selecting people who know that they can work together. A number of researchers have tackled the challenge of understanding how these vested interests form. So in 1963, George Kelly created a concept called personal constructs, where he looked at the configuration of values that people hold and observed that every configuration value sort of defines a personality, and people tend to stick together with similar personalities. Donald Shern and Martin Ryan, about 30 years later, 93, came up with a concept of frame reflections, saying that people approach contested policy spaces through particular frames of reference. That was built on by Martin Hajar, who has used a process called discourse analysis to connect theories of power and an understanding of power politics to this idea of frame reflection in policy discourses. Now, with the possible exception of Kelly, these are mostly quantitative processes. What I've focused on is a quantitative method of mapping these frames by identifying the configuration of concepts that determine these ideological positions. So this provides a map where we can understand which concepts appear together. We can identify the conflicting sets. So we see that this section here doesn't align with this section here. So we can see a dissonance between those two positions, and that allows us to develop and position groups of impact projects on a specific challenge. So I call this the stingray diagram. My colleague Dr. Sanzoni prefers stealth bombers. Well, I say, why pick the copy when you can have the original? So we look at how this stealth diagram maps onto food systems in southeast Queensland, or the food security inquiry, which I studied. The first stingray is basically business as usual. So grow more food is in set 1, and we can see that that stretches right across the concepts. Most concepts align with the idea that we need to grow more food. One group of people who are of that point of view is high-tech food futures, but high-tech food futures doesn't satisfy everybody. There's a lot of small farmers, there's a lot of nature-based farmers, there's a lot of regenerative farmers and so on who want to grow more food, who more or less align with business as usual, but they don't think that high-tech food futures are the solution. When we look at the next stingray, we can see that systemic thinkers. So we've got, generally speaking, people who are ethical. We can see that the third set of concepts is agreed with, across the board. Not much of agreement with point 2, the high-tech food futures, but a reasonable amount of agreement with the set 1, the grow more food people, and with set 4 and with set 5. So 3 doesn't disagree with many people, just with 2. A lot of these systemic thinkers were hospitals, research institutes, education organisations generally, and welfare agencies. And they submitted to the government that a Ministry of Food would help place food at the centre of all of those things and create a preventative wellness program. Now, that was completely ignored by the government and mostly ignored. The Ministry of Food was noted, and an Assistant Minister of Food responsible for building exports has been created. But largely, that second stingray was ignored in the inquiry and in the government's response to it. Now, we see out here the outlier, number 5, doesn't agree with growing more food. So it's like degrowth in terms of responding to the tension between capital and sustainability. Now, 5 does have a lot of agreement with part 3, it's an ethical position, and these radical approaches included community gardens, Indigenous food advocates, guerrilla gardeners, and many other some place-based solutions and nature-based solutions. They were small in number because it was mainly industry bodies that responded to the submission. So this is really just an example of how we read the stingray diagram so that we can think about how we might actually lobby government to get attention paid to these systemic solutions. Now, that's not too dissimilar with the map that I came up with when I studied food networks in southeast Queensland. So instead of stingrays, I've drawn hexagons, and they roughly map onto the concepts, the yellow circles, used by academics and corporations to discuss the same field. Now, it's significant that government responds to these different sections completely differently. It's investing billions of dollars in high-tech production and onshoring manufacturing. It's providing grants, hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars, to food-related SMEs and social enterprise. And then it treats social justice and community scale projects as a form of welfare. So those are drip fed. And so rather than seeing them all as part of a food system and of a coherent solution, there is a very scattered approach with very different responses. Now, across both of those bodies of work and other areas that I've looked at in terms of business and sustainability and ethical futures, we see a number of tensions re-emerging and re-emerging. We're going to go through each of those in turn, but what I would note is that while many of us would say we sit comfortably on the right-hand column of this table, once we started to discuss the details, we would find that we've had a lot of dissonance between us about what we thought. For example, some of the guerrilla gardeners go out and plant gardens without discussing them with the neighbours. They see that as one way, it's the only way to create systemic change. The local community groups are furious about that and see them as creating a hostile reaction from the people in the suburb and want to see that done systematically through through co-collaborative change. And so we see these sort of tensions emerging about the definitions of these things. So let's thinking about this idea of decoupling to allow economic growth to happen without environmental harm. So the problem is that as we increase our production, our affluence and our population, our footprint, our emissions, if that's how we're measuring our footprint, currently is growing faster than GDP. What we need to do is reduce that, and so incremental changes allow us to get that line below GDP. But we have to work a lot harder to decrease our footprint. We have to turn the graph downwards, and we have to work much, much harder to get it below the planetary boundaries. So there's a relationship which we generally call IPAT, impact equals people times or population times affluence, ameliorated by technology, IPAT. And if we have 20% more people and they each get 20% richer, then technology has to become 44% more efficient just to stay at the same point. So if GDP is growing as a function of population and affluence, then productivity has to increase faster than the multiple of those two things. Now, this is an article from 2010, so the figures are 25 years, well, the figures are 25 years out of date. The article is 15 years old. What we see here is that emissions, population and wealth are all going up. And then we see suddenly in the 2 or 3 years before this graph was made, emissions take off. They go up much more quickly than population or affluence. And the reason is, when we look at the blue line, the carbon intensity of GDP, how much carbon is emitted for every dollar created in the GDP, we see that technology has been keeping that slightly better than flat. We're becoming more productive as we become more technologically capable, but that stopped working at around 2002. Now, I don't have figures for this exact graph that are more recent than that, but there's been a lot of studies published recently about the decoupling of GDP from emissions. There's a lot of argument about what those figures show, but most of the serious academics are saying there's not solid evidence that we are achieving GDP decoupling. Now, systemic or incremental change. One of the good luck stories, or one of the good news stories coming out of the food security inquiry, is that regenerative beef farming has caught on. The big money's got behind it. People are spending hundreds of millions of dollars building cell farming or other forms of regenerative beef farming in the US. This picture's from Montana. The question is this systemic change? So we can decouple beef production from environmental harm if we were to roll this out on a global scale, but it's still only one part of the puzzle. And the challenge about wicked problems is that solving one part of the problem doesn't solve the overall problem. We have the thing known as Jevons paradox, where the more efficiently we grow beef, the more people eat it, and so the more farmland we're using, and so deforestation is going to occur regardless of whether the cows are industrially harmed or regeneratively farmed. So systemic change is more than just solving one problem at a time. This is the nature of complexity. And so the Kinefin diagram talks about the difference between obvious or simple problems, complicated problems, complex problems, and a chaotic world where we can't even identify the problems. The challenge that this is implicit in this diagram, or there's a number of challenges implicit in this diagram, but the first one, or one of the most important to me, is that we all tend to respond to problems with the knowledge that we have from the way that we've solved them before. So most people think that problems are simple and they approach them as a simple problem. If I heat up this water, its temperature will increase. If I heat it up enough, the water will boil. This is a simple relationship. We know exactly what the outcome is going to be. So in interviewing businesses about their sustainability, most of them resisted the idea that sustainability was complex. Oh, all I have to do is reduce my plastic use, increase my water recycling, reduce my electricity consumption, bring customers with me on this journey, and then we will move towards sustainability. And so they are bringing a simple frame to the problem of sustainability in business. Most of the systemic thinkers that I spoke to said it's really complex. You can't solve these problems one at a time. We need to create a systemic change that has a radical impact on the way we think. There's a lot more that we could say about this diagram, but I need to move on. So, one of the things I would say in reference to the framework that I'm proposing and the other things we've looked at is that ideological positions simplify problems. They say, oh, this is because of that, or I believe that this is true and therefore these other things follow. So when we are looking at people's entrenched ideological positions, we need to understand that they are probably applying a simple framing to the problem. We need to understand where each problem is located on this map. Not every problem is complex. And as we'll see in a minute, there are ways that we can move back around this diagram and come up with the appropriate response. Another thing that's often pointed out is that if we live on the simple block, we are in danger of falling off a cliff into chaos because we don't recognise the difference between obvious solutions and complicated and complex problems. Now, relating that to Mazzucato's mission map, what we can see is that she's recognised the complexity of these grand goals and even the missions that make them up. What she's proposing is that we go into the cross-sectoral collaboration and come up with specific narrow impact projects. And so each project can then be tackled using an impact map, and that impact map allows us to create a relatively simple pathway towards an outcome. So you see that she's been careful here to maintain the language of complexity, talking about potential, likelihood and iterative progress, rather than saying this will achieve that outcome. Nevertheless, what she has done is provide a way to deal with complexity largely through that co-collaboration in the messy middle. What I'm proposing is not different to that, it's complementary to that, and I think we should map that middle. So instead of just working with some self-selected people on impact projects that we know that we can agree on, what we need to do is identify where the points of tension and the points of resonance are so that we can have the greatest impact possible. So here's a couple of examples from my work. This is a community garden in the backyard of 50 townhouses. So the politics are unbelievable. The power of nature is incredible. This was a lawn 3 years ago. And the personal relationships it's inspired are heartwarming. But its future is on a knife edge. It's a constant battle to keep it going. And that QR code there goes to an article describing the process and the politics. Here is a picture of the police pulling apart a community garden here in Brisbane, a guerrilla garden built without the permission of the landowners. I know that the landowners are the Department of Mine and Energy because I used to live in that block of flats. I built a community garden there 12 years ago, which was bulldozed by the Departments of Mine and Energy. And so what we see is that governments not only ignore the systemic thinkers and the radical solutions, they actively oppose them. At Food Connect, on the board of the Food Connect Foundation, we have a shed, a food hub that attempts to support this messy middle and create the missing links in that messy middle so that we nurture the innovators and the change that can drive this forward. And so rather than just picking off individual impact projects, we create an overarching project which we call the value chain, and by mapping the value chain we can connect people together and start to have an impact on the overarching regime, as some people call it. One of those people is Mayer Goepel, whose book The Great Mind Shift maps out the fact that economics cannot solve the ethical futures that we want. She's been examining socio-technical theories of innovation and noted, as I have, that they assume that market forces drive change. She's pointing out that sustainability requires sacrifice, and that is the opposite of what drives market forces. And so it requires a major paradigm shift. I won't go into the details of this diagram, but I just want to say that ethical futures will not emerge from going into battle or by simply hoping for them. We have to embrace complexity and do the hard work required to allow those narratives to emerge and drive the change that we want to see. In fact, you notice that I said that we're going to allow the narratives to merge rather than we need to replace or knock down the dominant paradigm. Whether or not I'm right about that, we certainly need to identify the dissonance within the dominant ideology so that we can weaken its hold on the public imagination. So see all these little pale blue dots out here? These are the outliers that are potentially able to strengthen an alternative view rather than the dominant view. So by gathering those outliers and connecting them with ethical alternatives, we can strengthen the argument that governments need to support the alternative paradigm as well as the dominant one. And to achieve that, we need to agree to disagree. We need to accept that there is dissonance within any given community and focus on the resonance that allows us to build the projects between us and achieve the outcomes that resonate with the ethical future that we all desire. Thank you very much.